But the throne now passed to his son, the Prince of Wales, Charles. Charles was 25. He was very short, barely 5 feet tall. He was extremely shy. He stammered badly. He'd had an older brother, Henry, who had been the Prince of Wales, whom everybody assumed was going to succeed. But in 1612, Henry had died, so Charles was pushed forward, really without much experience or education for the job of being future king. Well, the marriage went forward, and the Princess Royal arrived from France. Charles was very worried about this marriage because he was afraid his future wife would be taller than he. After all, his grandmother was 6 feet tall. And of course, when Henrietta Maria was introduced to him, she proved to be even smaller than he. She was a delightfully pretty little tiny person, Henriette Marie, or as we know her in England, Henrietta Maria. Their relationship grew. They eventually produced children. They had a good and bonding marriage, which lasted as long as they lived. Now, Charles and Henrietta had an excellent court, beautiful taste. They made huge collections of art, sculpture, silverwork, all kinds of elegant things. They surrounded themselves. They were all musical. Their children were all taught instruments. Everybody sang, played instruments. They had concerts. Famous musicians were brought into court to perform. It was a highly cultivated court. A close family, although both the husband and wife worshiped differently, and they respected each other's religious difference. The Rump Parliament set up the High Court of Justice. There were 40 judges on this court, like a military court. Oh gosh, this is sounding familiar too. And they tried the king. Now the king, he appeared, this little man in a black suit. He comported himself with great dignity. He was always a dignified man. His arguments were cogent and correct. He had lost his stammer. He said, "You have absolutely no authority over a king. There is no law in England governing a king. The king is above the law." And of course, their whole argument was the king was not above the law, that he was subject to the law. Well, he lost the argument, as you can imagine. He was convicted of treason based on the correspondence I mentioned, and sentenced to death. No king of England has ever been sentenced to death. And when the news got out, the public was astonished. This can't be. The king is semi-divine. He is... You can't kill him. Well, the date of execution was set. I'll never forget that day. That was January the 30th, 1649. It was miserable and cold. It had been thundery and dark and rainy for days. People were coming into London from all over. The city was crowded with people. They couldn't believe it. They were going to execute the king. Well, the actual physical execution took place on a scaffolding they'd set up outside the Whitehall banqueting hall. And it was surrounded by a huge courtyard, walled in. But the public was allowed inside this. And there were troops everywhere, in the roadways, everywhere. Because the army party was afraid that if this didn't work, there'd be a rebellion and they had to be prepared. But when the king stepped out onto the scaffolding, it was astonishing because the sun broke through and shone on the scaffolding and the king. And everybody, oh, look, an omen from God. Well, he had said to his servant who'd taken care of him, he said, "Give me 3 or 4 shirts. I don't want to appear to shiver and quail in front of these men." So he was dressed heavily under shirts, but nothing in the way of a coat. His hair was bound up under a cap. Now, the whole premise of this was to humiliate the monarchy, to make the king grovel. And they knew it would be very difficult to make this man grovel. There was a law governing execution. Occasionally, when a prisoner sentenced to be executed died in the cell before the execution took place, they dragged the corpse out, they put a low block down under the neck of the corpse and beheaded it. So the sentence had been carried out. Ordinarily, you knelt down in front of a chest-high block and you put your head on the block and were struck. They thought if they could get the king into this position to grovel on the floor. They put the corpse block down there over the side. He would have to get down on the floor and crawl over. Well, as he stepped out, he saw what was going on, and he knew what was in their intentions. He went over to the bishop. They'd allowed him a bishop at the last minute. And there was a prayer. He gave the bishop his notes and things that he wanted to have delivered to his medals and so on. And then he turned to the executioner, who was Richard Brandon, but everybody thought it might have been Oliver Cromwell because he was masked. Executioners are seldom masked. But he paid him. And you always pay your executioner. Please remember this when you want a clean cut. And he said, "Strike when I thrust forth my arms." And then he gracefully got down on his hands and knees, placed his head on the block, and shot forward his hands. And Brandon struck. As he raised the head, there was a huge gasp throughout the crowd. They couldn't believe it. And yet here it had happened. And I'll swear there was a thunderclap. There probably wasn't. But I remember a thunderclap. So it was terrible drama. And everybody moaned, and there was weeping, and there was wailing, and carrying on of that sort. But no movement in the crowd. Until about 15 minutes later, the head was being displayed. And the crowd began to disperse. "By God, boys, we've done it! There's no uprising. We've won." And they had.